My dad said I dressed like a baddie boo and told me to cover up, so I gave him exactly what he asked for. It started when I wore a tank top and shorts to the grocery store on a 90-degree day. You're not leaving the house dressed like a baddie boo, my dad said while I was grabbing my car keys. I looked down at my completely normal summer outfit. Cover yourself up because I'm not having my daughter walking around looking like she's for sale, he continued, his face red with anger. I went back upstairs and changed into jeans and a hoodie despite the heat, and he nodded approvingly while saying this was about respect and dignity and protecting my reputation. That night, I did some online shopping with his credit card since he cared so much about my clothing choices. Thank you for helping me understand modesty, I said the next morning, wearing a full-length denim dress that covered everything except my hands and face. He seemed pleased until we got to his office barbecue where everyone kept asking if I was feeling okay and why I was dressed for winter. She's exploring modest fashion, he explained uncomfortably, while his coworkers exchanged concerned looks, and I stood there sweating through 3 layers of fabric. Monday, I wore a beekeeper suit to school because Dad had been very clear about covering up and protecting myself from unwanted attention. The principal called him within an hour asking if everything was all right at home and whether I was being forced to wear extreme religious garments. It's just a phase, my dad told them, but I made sure to explain loudly in the main office that my father said my body was shameful and needed to be completely hidden from men's eyes. The counselor started taking notes while my dad's face turned purple. Tuesday brought his important client dinner at the country club and I arrived in a full burqa. I'd ordered express shipping from Amazon. This is our daughter, my dad said weakly as his Japanese investors stared in complete confusion. They kept asking questions about our family's religious beliefs and whether this was common in American households while I sat silently eating through my face covering. His biggest client pulled him aside to discuss their concerns about doing business with someone who had such extreme views about women, and I heard my dad desperately trying to explain it was just teenage rebellion. Wednesday, I upgraded to a hazmat suit for his company picnic because he'd mentioned protection so many times that biological protection seemed appropriate. His boss's wife cornered him by the potato salad to express her deep concern about what was happening in our home. If you need resources for controlling behavior or religious extremism, we have employee assistance programs, she said while I stood nearby in my yellow containment suit, explaining to anyone who asked that my dad said my skin was too dangerous to be exposed to the public. Thursday was parent-teacher conferences, and I wore a Victorian morning dress complete with a black veil that covered my entire face. My teacher asked my dad point blank if he was abusing me or forcing me into a cult while I sat there looking like a gothic ghost from 1850. She seems to be crying for help, the teacher said sternly while my dad tried to explain that I was doing this to myself, but she'd already seen my essay about how my father called me A for wearing normal clothes. Friday, I went full throttle when I wore a full medieval suit of armor to his promotion announcement dinner because nothing says covered up like actual metal plating. The clanking drew everyone's attention as I walked in, and his regional manager immediately asked why his daughter was dressed like she was going into battle. My dad says my body is a weapon that needs to be contained. I announced to the entire restaurant, and several people took out their phones to record while my dad tried to disappear into his chair. His promotion was put on hold pending an investigation into his home situation. Saturday morning, the neighbors had organized an intervention after seeing me mow the lawn in a radiation suit all week. We're concerned about your daughter's well-being, Mrs. Jacobs said, while 6 other concerned parents stood behind her. They'd documented everything with photos and timestamps, creating what they called evidence of escalating abuse. My dad kept insisting I was doing this to spite him, but I maintained perfect innocence and said I was just following his rules about modesty and covering my shameful body. By Sunday, his girlfriend had dumped him via text, saying she couldn't date someone who psychologically tortured his daughter. His boss had suggested he take family leave to deal with his issues, and Child Protective Services had opened a case file after receiving 17 different reports from concerned citizens. He sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands while I stood there in my newest purchase, which was a full deep sea diving suit complete with brass helmet. Please stop this, he begged, but I reminded him that he'd said I dressed like I needed to cover up. Fine, wear whatever you want, he said in defeat. But then his phone rang, and his lawyer's name appeared on the screen. My mom had heard about everything from concerned friends and was filing for emergency custody based on psychological abuse. As he answered the phone, his face went white, and he looked at me with something dark in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Actually, forget the clothes, he said very quietly. I have a better idea for how to teach you a lesson. His eyes stayed cold and dark as he set his phone down on the kitchen counter, and I knew right away that whatever this better idea was, it meant something way worse than just clothes. My stomach dropped hard when he walked toward me, and the brass diving helmet suddenly felt way too heavy on my shoulders. I needed to get out of this house right now. He moved past me toward the stairs without saying anything else, and I grabbed my phone from the table with shaking hands inside the thick rubber gloves. I typed as fast as I could to Mom while listening to his footsteps going up the stairs. I told her about his threat and begged her to come get me immediately. She texted back within seconds saying she was already on her way with Shinman, her lawyer, and told me to stay visible and keep my phone recording. I fumbled with the phone settings through the diving gloves and started recording just as Dad's footsteps came back to the top of the stairs. He came down carrying an old brown suitcase that I recognized from the hall closet, and he dropped it on the kitchen floor with a heavy thud. He announced that I was going to a wilderness camp for troubled teens starting tomorrow morning. He'd already paid the deposit while I was upstairs changing into the diving suit, and they specialized in fixing disrespectful daughters who embarrassed their families. The place was called Redemption Ranch, and it was somewhere in Utah, and they'd already sent someone to pick me up at 5 hours in the morning. Before I could even process what he was saying, the doorbell rang loud and urgent. Dad's face went from satisfied to confused. As he walked to the door, and through the helmet's small window, I saw Mom standing there with a woman in a business suit and 2 police officers. Mom pushed past Dad and showed the officers a stack of papers while explaining she was here to collect me based on safety concerns. The woman in the suit was Shin Man, and she held up an official-looking document with a court seal. Dad tried to block the doorway and started yelling that this was kidnapping and they couldn't just take his daughter. Shin Mahan stayed completely calm and explained that the emergency custody order gave Mom temporary custody, effective immediately. The 2 officers stood in the doorway making sure nobody got physical while Dad's face turned purple with rage. He kept pointing at me in the diving suit and saying I was the one causing all this drama, but the officers just watched him carefully. Mom told me to go pack my things, and I waddled up the stairs as fast as the heavy suit would let me. I grabbed my school backpack and threw in random clothes from my dresser, my laptop, phone charger, and the folder where I kept all the receipts from my costume purchases. Dad followed us around the house, ranting about conspiracy and manipulation while I packed. He kept saying I'd poisoned everyone against him when all I did was follow his own own rules about covering up. Mom helped me get the diving helmet off so I could see better, and Dad grabbed it from her hands and threw it against the wall. One of the officers stepped into the house and told Dad to calm down or they'd have to arrest him. I changed out of the diving suit in my bathroom while Mom stood guard outside the door, and I could hear Dad downstairs still arguing with Shinam about parental rights. When I came out in normal clothes for the first time in a week, Mom hugged me tight and whispered that everything would be okay now. We walked downstairs where Dad was pacing in the living room while the officers watched him. He tried one more time to stop us from leaving, but Zinman reminded him that violating the emergency order would result in immediate arrest. Dad stood in the doorway watching as we got into Mom's car, and I saw him kick the doorframe hard as we pulled away. At Mom's apartment that night, we sat at her small kitchen table while Shin Man spread out a bunch of legal documents. She explained that the custody hearing would happen in 2 weeks, and we needed to document absolutely everything. She said Dad's threat about the wilderness camp actually helped our case because those places had terrible reputations for abuse. She'd already filed a motion to prevent him from sending me anywhere without court approval, and she wanted copies of all my costume receipts as evidence. Mom made us tea while Sinan took photos of everything with her phone, including screenshots of Dad's angry texts that had started coming through. She told me not to respond to any of his messages and to forward everything to her immediately. Monday morning at the school felt weird and normal at the same time. I walked into the counseling office before first period, and Adeline Bray immediately stood up from her desk when she saw me. She pulled me into her office and closed the door, asking how I was doing after the weekend's events. She'd been keeping detailed notes since the beekeeper suit incident and wanted to make sure I felt safe at Mom's place. She had a thick folder on her desk with my name on it, and I could see printed emails and her handwritten notes sticking out. She asked if I needed any accommodations at the school or if there were any safety concerns she should know about. Right. As I was telling her about the emergency custody order, we heard shouting from the main office. Through the window, I saw Dad at the front desk arguing with the secretary about seeing me. The principal came out of his office and stood between Dad and the hallway to the counseling office. Dad kept saying he had parental rights and they couldn't keep him from his daughter, getting louder with each word. The principal calmly but firmly told him he needed to leave or they'd call the police, and Dad slammed his hand on the counter. I watched through the office window as 2 security guards appeared and escorted him toward the door while he shouted about lawsuits. He saw me watching through the window and pointed at me, yelling something I couldn't hear through the glass. Adeline Bray immediately called Mom to let her know what happened, then called Jin Man to report the incident. That afternoon, Mom picked me up from the school early because Josiah Tanaka from CPS was coming for our first official interview. He arrived at Mom's apartment carrying a tablet and a thick case file, and he had a kind but serious expression. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and explained that he'd been assigned to investigate the 17 different reports that had been filed. He was thorough but gentle with his questions, asking about everything from the first tank top incident to the diving suit confrontation. He took photos of all my costume receipts, writing down dates and amounts while asking about Dad's specific words and reactions to each outfit. He seemed especially interested in the wilderness camp threat and asked for any documentation about Redemption Ranch that Dad might have mentioned. I pulled out my phone and showed him the wilderness camp website. Dad had bookmarked on our shared family computer 3 days ago. Hosea took screenshots of everything, including the part about breaking rebellious spirits through isolation and hard labor. My phone started buzzing with texts from Dad right then, and he kept sending message after message. The first one said he was sorry and just wanted to talk, but then they got angrier, saying I was ruining his life. Mom grabbed my phone and started screenshotting each text as they came in faster and faster. Dad wrote that I destroyed his career and his relationship, and now I was trying to take away his parental rights. He said no college would accept me after what I'd done, and he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of manipulative person I really was. Mom forwarded everything to Shin, who called us back within minutes, saying this harassment violated the emergency custody order. She told us to keep documenting everything and not to respond to any of his messages no matter what he said. That same afternoon, we found out from a co-worker friend that Huang Parrish had called Dad into his office after lunch. The whole company was talking about how Dad got put on administrative leave while they investigated all the CPS reports that had been filed. Someone had posted the armor incident video on social media, and it went viral with thousands of views and comments about toxic parenting. The regional manager was worried about the company's reputation and wanted Dad away from the office until everything got sorted out. Dad's co-worker said he left the building carrying a box of his desk stuff and looked completely defeated. 2 days later on Wednesday, I had my first meeting with Al Bampos at the family court building downtown. She had a small office with toys and books, even though I was too old for most of them. She asked me to tell her about life at home before the tank top incident, and I explained how Dad always had rules about everything. He picked my clothes for school pictures and important events and got mad if I wore makeup or styled my hair differently. She wrote notes while I talked about how he monitored my social media and read my text messages every night. She seemed really interested when I mentioned he'd thrown away clothes he didn't like without asking me first. She asked if there were other controlling behaviors, and I told her about the time he made me quit drama club because the costumes were too revealing. That evening, Mom got a call from someone we didn't expect, which was Dad's ex-girlfriend from 6 months ago. She'd heard about everything from mutual friends and wanted to help however she could. She told Mom that Dad's controlling behavior was why she left, and the diving suit story was just the final straw. She said there were so many red flags she'd ignored, like him telling her what to wear to his work events and getting jealous when male coworkers talked to her. She offered to write a statement or testify about his patterns of control, and Mom gave her Shin's contact information. The next day, Hosea came back to interview our neighbors and spent hours at Mrs. E. Jacobs' house going through her documentation. She'd been taking photos of me in the different costumes all week because she was so concerned about what was happening. She showed him timestamps proving the escalation from the beekeeper suit on Monday to the diving suit on Sunday. 3 other neighbors came over to talk to him, and they all said they'd been worried enough to consider calling someone even before the intervention. One neighbor said she'd seen Dad yelling at me in the driveway multiple times over normal teenage stuff like playing music too loud. Thursday morning, Shin called to tell us Dad's lawyer had reached out with a settlement proposal. He wanted to get unsupervised weekend visits if he completed an anger management course and agreed to therapy. Shin said absolutely not, and that we weren't negotiating anything until Alba Ampos finished her complete evaluation. She said Dad's lawyer was trying to minimize the situation, but the evidence was too strong to ignore. At the school that day, the rumors were everywhere, and I couldn't walk down the hall without people staring or whispering. Some kids thought the whole costume thing was hilarious and kept asking if I still had the armor. Others seemed genuinely worried and asked if I was okay or needed anything. My friend showed me screenshots from social media where people were sharing the video and arguing about whether I was a genius or went too far. Adeline Bray pulled me aside between classes and offered to move my schedule around if I needed space from all the the attention. I told her I wanted to keep my normal routine because changing everything would just make it worse. She said she understood, but reminded me her door was always open if things got overwhelming. Friday started normal, but everything changed that evening when we heard someone buzzing every apartment in Mom's building. Mom looked through the peephole and saw Dad standing in the hallway, even though he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near us. He must have convinced someone to let him in because he was pounding on our door, yelling that he just wanted to see his daughter. Mom told me to lock myself in the bathroom while she called 911, and I could hear Dad getting louder and angrier in the hallway. The police arrived within 10 minutes, and I heard them telling Dad he was under arrest for violating the protective order. He kept arguing that he had rights as a father, but they didn't care and took him away in handcuffs. Mom held me while we both shook from the adrenaline and fear of what could have happened if he'd gotten inside. We found out the next morning that Dad spent Friday night in jail and got released Saturday with a court date for the violation. Shin called us right away, saying this actually helped our case significantly because it proved Dad couldn't respect legal boundaries. She said judges take protective order violations very seriously, and this would definitely impact the custody decision. The following week, Alba scheduled a second session with me to dig deeper into our family dynamics. She asked about specific incidents and wanted to understand patterns of behavior going back years. I told her about Dad criticizing my appearance constantly, like saying my legs were too fat for shorts or my arms looked flabby in tank tops. She asked how these comments affected me, and I explained that I started wearing baggy clothes to avoid his criticism long before the comment. She wanted to know about good memories too, but it was hard to think of times when Dad wasn't trying to control something about my life. Sunday morning, Mom pulled out 3 big photo albums from the storage closet, and we sat on her couch, spreading them across the coffee table. She opened the first one to my 5th birthday party, and I pointed at the pink princess dress Dad had picked out, even though I'd wanted the dinosaur costume. Every Halloween photo showed the same pattern, with Dad choosing my outfit while Mom stood quietly in the background. I flipped to Christmas photos where Dad always dressed me in formal dresses for his company parties, while other kids wore normal clothes. Mom's hands started shaking when we found pictures from my 8th grade graduation, where Dad made me change 3 times before settling on a dress that covered my knees. She kept saying she was sorry and wiping her eyes with tissues while I showed her dance recital photos where Dad had complained my leotard was too tight. The next week, Josiah called to update us about the case and mentioned Dad had enrolled himself in anger management classes at the community center. He said Dad's lawyer was pushing this as proof of taking responsibility, but the CPS investigation wasn't impressed by last-minute efforts. Hosea explained that 17 separate reports plus the arrest for violating the protective order created a pattern that classes couldn't fix overnight. Mom took notes while Hosea went through the timeline of events and said the hearing date was set for 2 weeks away. That same week, we got a letter from Dad's company about their internal investigation closing with him keeping his job but losing the promotion permanently. The letter said multiple employees had come forward about uncomfortable comments he'd made about women's clothing even before my costume protest started. Dad got moved to a different department with no direct reports and would have to complete sensitivity training before any future advancement opportunities. Mom read the letter twice, then filed it with all the other documents Shin had told us to keep for court. At the school, I had to write a personal essay for English class about a time I stood up for myself, and the words just poured out. I wrote about the tank top and the costumes, and how sometimes you have to make yourself impossible to ignore when nobody listens to your regular voice. My teacher read it during class while everyone else worked on grammar exercises, and I saw her eyes get wide at certain parts. After class, she pulled me aside and asked if she could submit it to the district writing contest with a fake name to protect my privacy. I agreed because the winner got a scholarship, and we needed money for legal fees that kept adding up every week. Wednesday before the hearing, Alba sent her evaluation to the court recommending supervised visits, only with required therapy, for Dad. The report was 12 pages long and used terms like narcissistic control patterns and coercive behaviors that went back years before the costume incident. She wrote that Dad showed no real understanding of how his actions affected me and kept blaming everyone else for the consequences. Shin called us excited because Alba's evaluation was exactly what we needed to show the judge this wasn't just teenage rebellion gone wrong. The next day, Dad's lawyer filed a response claiming I was manipulating everyone and that Mom was coaching me to destroy Dad's life. The document said I was a troubled teen seeking attention and that Mom had poisoned me against Dad to get revenge for their divorce. Shin laughed when she read it and said, "Judges see through this defensive strategy because it just proves the parent won't take any responsibility." She explained that blaming the child usually backfires badly in custody cases, especially with all our documentation backing up my side. The night before court, I couldn't eat dinner and kept pacing around Mom's apartment, checking my phone every few minutes. Mom made hot chocolate and we sat on the couch while she walked me through what would happen in the courtroom tomorrow. She promised no matter what the judge decided, she wouldn't let me go back to an unsafe situation, even if it meant moving to another state. I finally fell asleep around 2 hours in the morning with Mom still sitting next to me rubbing my back like when I was little. Thursday morning, we got to the courthouse early and waited outside the family court entrance with Shin reviewing last-minute details. Dad showed up in an expensive gray suit with his lawyer who looked annoyed about something. As they walked toward us, Dad started walking directly at me, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him back, whispering urgently about making things worse. We all stood there awkwardly until the bailiff opened the courtroom doors and called our case number for the custody hearing. Inside the courtroom, Judge Hood sat behind a tall wooden desk, looking through a stack of papers thick enough to be a phone book. I sat between Mom and Shin at one table while Dad and his lawyer sat at another table across the aisle from us. The judge asked for a 15-minute recess to finish reviewing all the evidence because there was so much documentation to process. When she came back, Judge Hood started with preliminary questions about the protective order violation, and Dad's lawyer tried to minimize it as a misunderstanding. The judge cut him off and said violating court orders was never a misunderstanding, and moved on to the main custody issues. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness chair trying not to shake while the bailiff had me promise to tell the truth. Shin asked me to describe the original incident with the tank top, and I explained everything just like we'd practiced staying calm and factual. Judge Hood leaned forward when I got to the part about Dad's threat of a better idea and asked me to explain exactly what he meant. I told her about the wilderness camp brochure he'd shown me and how those places were known for abusing kids to make them obedient. The judge wrote something down and nodded for Shin to continue with her questions, while Dad shifted in his chair looking uncomfortable about the wilderness camp topic coming up. When it was Dad's turn to testify, his lawyer asked him easy questions first about providing for me and being a concerned parent trying to guide his teenage daughter. Dad sat up straighter and explained how he'd always worked hard to give me everything I needed and just wanted me to have self-respect and dignity in how I presented myself to the world. His lawyer asked about the tank top top incident, and Dad said, I was exaggerating everything because teenagers do that, and he'd simply asked me to dress more appropriately for a young lady. The judge leaned forward and asked him directly why he used the word if he was just concerned about appropriate clothing. Dad's mouth opened and closed a few times before he said he didn't remember using that exact word. And maybe I misunderstood what he meant about dressing modestly. Judge Hood wrote more notes while Dad's face got red, and his lawyer quickly moved to the next question about his relationship history. That's when things got interesting because Dad's ex-girlfriend walked into the courtroom wearing a business suit and looking determined as she took the witness stand. She told the judge about the 6 months they dated and how Dad constantly commented on her outfits, saying her skirts were too short or her shirts too tight for a woman her age. She described how he'd check her phone to see who she was texting and got mad when male coworkers liked her social media posts, even though they were just vacation photos. He'd made her delete several male friends from social media, claiming it was inappropriate for a woman in a relationship to have male friends online. She said leaving him was the hardest but best decision she ever made because the control got worse over time, not better. When she finished testifying, she looked at me and mouthed that she was sorry she hadn't spoken up sooner before walking out of the courtroom. Next, Adeline from the school took the stand carrying a thick folder that she set on the witness box as she got sworn in by the bailiff. She opened the folder and pulled out dated notes starting from the day I showed up in the beekeeper suit all the way through the diving helmet incident. She documented every conversation we had, including my emotional state and the specific things I'd said about Dad's rules and comments about my body. She told Judge Hood in her professional counselor voice that she believed I was crying for help through my costume protest because I didn't know how else to make adults listen. She explained how victims of emotional abuse often use extreme behaviors to signal distress when direct communication fails, and that's exactly what she saw happening with my escalating costume choices. Judge Hood thanked her for the detailed documentation and asked her opinion on my current emotional state and safety needs going forward. Adeline said she believed I needed stability and support away from the source of control while working through the emotional impact of what I'd experienced. After Adeline stepped down, Judge Hood turned to Dad and asked him directly about the wilderness camp he'd threatened to send me to after the diving suit incident. Dad's lawyer tried to object, but the judge said it was directly relevant to determining custody and safety, so Dad had to answer the question. He admitted he'd looked into a program called Redemption Ranch that specialized in troubled teens, but claimed he was just trying to scare me into stopping the costume thing. Judge Hood asked if he'd paid any money to this program, and Dad reluctantly admitted he'd put down a $500 deposit to hold a spot, but hadn't actually planned to send me there. The judge's face got hard as she made extensive notes, and I saw her underline something 3 times on her legal pad. While Dad squirmed in his seat, she asked him if he knew these wilderness programs had been investigated for abuse, and several had been shut down for endangering children. Dad said he'd only heard good things about teaching kids discipline and respect, but the judge shook her head and wrote more notes, looking increasingly unhappy with his answers. After 3 hours of testimony and evidence, Judge Hood said she'd heard enough to make her decision about temporary custody arrangements. While the full investigation continued, she stated that based on the evidence presented, including the documented pattern of controlling behavior and the threat of sending me to a potentially harmful program, she was granting Mom full temporary custody. Dad would get supervised visitation every other Saturday for 2 hours at a court-approved family center, with a social worker present to monitor interactions. He would need to complete anger management classes and at least 6 months of therapy, with a court-approved therapist before any unsupervised visitation could even be considered. Dad's lawyer immediately stood up saying they planned to appeal this decision because it was based on exaggerated claims and misunderstandings about normal parental discipline. Judge Hood's voice got cold as she warned that any further violations of court orders, including attempting contact outside approved channels or any form of harassment, would result in complete termination of parental rights. She said she'd reviewed the police report from Dad's arrest for violating the protective order, and that showed a clear pattern of refusing to respect legal boundaries. Dad's face went white as he finally seemed to understand this wasn't something he could talk his way out of or minimize as teenage drama anymore. Outside the courthouse, Mom and I walked toward the parking lot when Dad came rushing up, trying to talk to me one more time about how this was all wrong. Before he could get close, Josiah stepped between us, holding up his hand and reminding Dad that all communication had to go through official channels now, per the judge's order. He told Dad that approaching me violated the custody order, and he'd have to document this attempt, which could impact future custody decisions. Dad backed away, looking angry and defeated, while Hosea walked us to Mom's car, making sure Dad didn't try to follow us to the parking lot. That evening, Mom ordered pizza from my favorite place, and we sat on her couch eating in silence for a while, just processing everything that had happened in court. She started crying and apologized for not protecting me sooner, saying she should have seen the signs, but she'd been so focused on avoiding conflict during the divorce. I told her I was just grateful she was here now when I really needed her, and that she'd stood up for me when it mattered most. Friday at the school felt weird, but good because I knew I wouldn't have to go back to Dad's house that afternoon or worry about what mood he'd be in. Adeline pulled me into her office during lunch to check how I was doing after the intense court hearing and all the testimony about my situation. She reminded me that healing from this kind of experience isn't a straight line, and it's normal to have complicated feelings about Dad, even though his behavior was wrong. The weekend at Mom's apartment passed quietly, and I realized while getting dressed Sunday morning that it was the first time in years I'd picked clothes without any anxiety. I put on shorts and a tank top because it was warm outside and walked to the grocery store with Mom to get ingredients for dinner. Nobody said anything mean about my outfit or made me feel ashamed for showing my arms and legs on a hot day like normal people do all the time. 2 weeks later, the family center called to schedule Dad's first supervised visit, and Mom drove me there on a Saturday morning while my stomach felt like it had rocks in it. The building looked like a converted daycare with bright murals on the walls and plastic chairs in the waiting room where other kids sat with their custodial parents looking just as nervous. Dad showed up 5 minutes late wearing a new suit and carrying flowers, which the social worker immediately took away, explaining gifts weren't allowed during supervised visits. We went into a room with toys and books, even though I was way too old for most of them, while the social worker sat in the corner with a clipboard taking notes every few minutes. Dad spent the first hour telling me how much therapy was helping him understand his mistakes and how he'd changed completely in just 2 weeks, which seemed impossible. He kept asking if I missed him and when I could come home, while the social worker wrote faster and reminded him to focus on the present, not future living arrangements. The second hour dragged worse than the first, with Dad trying to get me to talk about school, but I just gave one-word answers and watched the clock above his head tick toward noon. When time was up, he tried to hug me, but I stepped back, and the social worker noted that too before walking us to separate exits so we wouldn't interact in the parking lot. Mom asked how it went on the drive drive home, and I just shrugged because there wasn't much to say about 2 hours of awkward silence and desperate promises. That Monday, Adeline Bray gave me a therapist card and said she'd already called to explain my situation, so I wouldn't have to start from scratch. The therapist's office was in a converted house with soft chairs and boxes of tissues everywhere, which made sense once we started talking about everything. She asked me to describe what happened with the clothes, but also wanted to know about years before that, which made me realize Dad's control went back way further than I'd thought. We talked about how he picked my friends and activities and always had reasons why certain things weren't appropriate for his daughter to do. Over the next few weeks between therapy sessions, Mom and I figured out how to live together without the constant fighting that happened at Dad's house. She asked what time I wanted to be home instead of telling me, and we negotiated chores based on our schedules, not arbitrary rules about respect. When I wanted to go to a movie with friends, she just asked normal parent questions about who was driving and what time it ended instead of interrogating me about boys. We even disagreed about some things, but she listened to my side and we compromised like regular people instead of her threatening punishments. A month after the custody hearing, Dad's lawyer filed paperwork saying he'd completed anger management and wanted unsupervised visits starting immediately. Judge Hood scheduled a hearing where Dad presented certificates from his classes and letters from his therapist saying he was making excellent progress. She looked through everything carefully, then said 6 months of supervised visits was the minimum before she'd even consider changing the arrangement. Dad's lawyer argued this was punitive, but Judge Hood reminded him that rebuilding trust after calling your teenage daughter takes more than a few anger management sessions. At the school, my English teacher submitted my essay about standing up to control to the district writing competition without telling me until it placed second. She pulled me aside after class, saying they wanted me to read it at the awards assembly, but understood if that felt like too much attention. I told her I'd accept the award on stage, but didn't want to read the essay out loud since everyone already knew enough about my family situation. The certificate came with a $50 gift card, and seeing my name on the program next to normal achievement stuff felt weirdly good. Every other Saturday became our new routine, with Dad showing up to the family center trying different approaches to get me to engage with him. Some weeks he brought board games, which we'd play in silence while the social worker watched, and other weeks he'd try talking about neutral topics like movies or sports. Slowly, he stopped pushing about coming home or changing custody and started actually listening when I mentioned things about school or friends. He even asked follow-up questions that seemed genuine instead of looking for information to use against Mom in court. 3 months after everything started, Mom filed divorce papers, citing irreconcilable differences and years of controlling behavior she couldn't ignore anymore. Dad didn't contest it, which surprised everyone, but his lawyer probably told him fighting would make the custody situation worse. The paperwork went through quickly since they'd already been separated and didn't have much shared property to divide. Therapy kept helping me see patterns I'd never noticed, like how I always apologized even when nothing was my fault, or how I'd check with friends multiple times before making any decision. My therapist worked with me on trusting my own judgment and speaking up when something bothered me instead of just going along to avoid conflict. We practiced setting boundaries with role-play scenarios until it started feeling more natural to say no without immediately backing down. When spring came around, I signed up for debate team, partly because Adeline Bray suggested activities where using my voice was the whole point. The coach paired me with experienced debaters who helped me structure arguments and find evidence to support different positions. Adeline stopped by practice one day and said she was proud of how I was turning a painful experience into something constructive. At the end of the school year, Dad's therapist called Mom asking if I'd come to a joint session to work on our relationship with professional support. Mom left it up to me, and after thinking about it for a week, I agreed to try one session to see how it went. Dad actually apologized without any excuses or explanations about how I'd misunderstood or overreacted to his parenting style. He said he let his own fears about protecting me turn into controlling behavior that hurt me, and he was sorry for all of it. The session ended with me feeling weird about his apology, but the therapist said that was normal after everything that happened. Mom picked me up and we drove home without talking much because there wasn't really anything to say yet. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a routine with supervised visits every other Saturday, while Dad kept going to his own therapy sessions. Mom started staying late at work more often now that she didn't have to manage Dad's schedule and moods anymore. Her boss noticed how much better she was performing and offered her the senior manager position she'd wanted for years. We went to this fancy steakhouse to celebrate, and I wore a blue dress I picked out myself just because I liked how it looked. Mom kept smiling at me across the table and said she was proud of both of us for getting through everything. 6 months passed with Dad following all the court requirements and never missing a therapy appointment or supervised visit. Judge Hood reviewed all the reports from the social workers and Dad's therapist at the review hearing. She decided he'd shown enough progress to try unsupervised Saturday visits, but with strict conditions about pickup times and activities. The first unsupervised visit felt super awkward with just the two of us in his car without a social worker watching. We went to this burger place we used to go to when I was little, and then saw some action movie that didn't require much talking. I wore shorts and a tank top since it was hot and caught him starting to say something about my outfit, but he stopped himself and asked about school instead. Every visit got a little easier, and we found safe topics like movies and homework that didn't bring up the past. My 18th birthday came right before senior year started, and Mom threw a small party with just my close friends at our apartment. Dad wasn't invited, but he sent a card that arrived that morning with a gift card to my favorite clothing store inside. The message just said happy birthday and love Dad without any weird comments about using it for appropriate clothes or anything. Controlling. College applications took over my whole fall with essays and deadlines and transcript requests. For my main essay, I wrote about finding your voice when someone tries to silence you and how sometimes you have to be impossible to ignore. My counselor read it and said it was one of the strongest personal statements she'd seen in her 20 years at the school. I applied to 7 schools, but really wanted to get into the state university's pre-law program. The acceptance letter came in March with a partial scholarship that would cover about half the tuition. Mom cried when I showed her, and Dad texted congratulations when I told him during our Saturday lunch. Graduation day was hot and sticky, but I didn't care. As I sat with my classmates, waiting to walk across the stage, Mom sat in the 3rd row. With her new boyfriend she'd started dating a few months earlier. Dad sat several rows behind them, respecting the boundaries we'd all agreed on with the therapist. When they called my name, I heard both of them cheering just as loud as each other, and it felt like real pride instead of ownership or control. After the ceremony, we took separate pictures, and Dad gave me a graduation card with a check inside before leaving so Mom could have her time. Packing for college meant going through everything in my room, including the closet where I'd stored all the costumes from that crazy week. The hazmat suit and diving helmet were still in their boxes, and I decided to donate them to the community theater downtown. They were thrilled to get authentic-looking costumes for their prop department questioned and didn't ask why I had them. I kept one of the modest dresses though, the long denim one I'd worn to Dad's office barbecue that started everything. Sometimes you need reminders of how far you've come and how you found your voice when someone tried to take it away. The dress hangs in the back of my dorm room closet now, and every time I see it, I remember that week when I made myself impossible to ignore. Dad and I still have Saturday lunches when I'm home from the school, and he's never commented on my clothes again. Mom got engaged to her boyfriend last month and asked if I was okay with it, which I was. Life moved on from that insane week of costumes, but the lesson stuck with me about standing up for yourself even when it seems crazy. Well, thanks for hanging out with me while I rambled through all those moments. Hope my questions didn't get too out there. Always a blast chatting with you, and I'll see you next time. Subscribe for more content like